as I dwelled around in LinkedIn to see how people were summarizing what we were experiencing, there was a lot of discussion about the bullwhip effect, because it was something that if you're in the supply chain area, you knew what it meant. For those people who were less supply chain savvy, it sounded like there was one solution. It was a bullwhip effect that was going on. And I have to say that I challenged a number of people on that, because the bullwhip effect has a number of conditions for it to exist. The first one was a lack of trust and transparency between, say, the retailer and the supplier, and inefficient communications around what's the demand looking like, what's your capacity to supply looking like, and collaborating on those kind of areas. It requires steady state, so that there's no disturbances in the overall pattern of demand. There might be slight ups and downs, but nothing substantial as this demand shock manifested itself. And there may be forecasting errors, but not to the extent they're statistically significant. Often the inventory is used to decouple suppliers from retailers. Inventory is put into position to defend the supplier's capacity, so that if there is a slight variation from the retail point of view, that it's covered off somehow. But it also relies on degrees of disorganization and a lack of supply chain integration. And then maybe technical misunderstandings of how demand is modeled and how we respond to it efficiently. The last one is gaming. Often retailers may be inclined to game the system, in the sense that retailers may ask suppliers to put a certain amount of production into their plans, and then as an event like a promotion doesn't go quite well, they tend to cancel the orders and leave the supplier with the problem. So there's a commercial advantage also to be gained by this kind of muddiness around the bullwhip effect, which may also be called the Forrester's demand amplification effect. But I can say that none of these conditions were actually met by the demand shock.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newberry. I'm a senior executive on call, helping businesses in a make, move, sell flow of consumer goods and services. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available through my website RetailAID.ca or on my YouTube channel RetailAID. Be sure to check it out. As the business world faces much volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity, organisations need to be tapping into resources with an inside edge on transitioning their teams to be agile, innovative and digital, with thought leaders, experts and senior executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations to help reorientate their enterprises. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started.
Okay, good afternoon everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Miriam and I'm very pleased to introduce Gary Newberry for today's webinar, who is going to talk about supply chain since COVID-19. So before we get started, I would like to quickly introduce Gary. So Gary has the CCLP designation and he's also a prize winner and a recognized thought leader in the retail supply chain of the future. Barry is originally from the UK, but since coming to Canada, he has been engaged with a large food service organization working on innovation and fulfillment excellence with their distribution network.
Thank you very much, Miriam. We've got a really busy agenda today. I've prepared plenty of materials. I'm going to talk initially about the supply chain disruptors that we've experienced here in Canada. I'm going to move on to how consumers, some of the factors that are influencing consumer behaviour. I'm going to talk about Canadian retail, a brief history, and then what the next steps are to reinvention. talk about some of the challenges of reorganizing our supply chains and the design factors within that, and probably wrap up with some personal keys for success for us as supply chain leaders in the businesses we are in. For those people who are here, I'm just going to, on the second session, I'm just going to run through the slides very quickly again. And for those people who aren't here, they just get the benefit of that, and what we haven't dealt with in this session. So let's talk about the supply chain disruptors. So we've had the COVID-19, we're in the middle of it, I should say. We shouldn't be surprised with COVID-19. Many people have described this as a black swan event, but we didn't know this was coming our way. But if we think about the last 20 years, and depending on whether or not you think that a pandemic, we've had 2 pandemics in 20 years. We've also had 3 epidemics. Epidemic is a regional manifestation of a virus. So we've had 5 opportunities to kind of refine our approach to this. For me, the black swan moment was government's intervention to respond to COVID. The emphasis was on protecting the healthcare system, making sure it didn't crumple, which would have led to considerable, I would say, civil unrest. If we were taken ill with it and we couldn't actually get to hospital to save our life, family members and other members of the community would be very upset and move towards civil unrest if that was the case. So the government chose to close down the economy, keeping only essential businesses alive, and put something in the order of nearly 50% of the working population on some form of, let's call it life support, some form of government funding. What I want to do during this slide is just to talk very briefly about the demand shock and the supply shock. I want to stop at that point and take any comments that you've made or want to make, or any questions you have, and then move on to the effect of the bullwhip effect in this situation, and then move on to the next slide. If you can have any questions, if you can try and make sure they're relatively short so I can sort of read them on the screen. In terms of a demand shock, the companies in the forefront of this are those ones typically in the grocery and pharmacy retail chains. What the statistics have shown me is that something like 3% of people went into sheer panic buying. So they rid the shelves of toilet rolls and basic staples like flour and pasta. But 97%, 3% went into the panic buying. 97% did one of 2 things, or a combination thereof. Firstly, when they went to their first trip into the local grocery store, they actually increased their basket size. So things that they wouldn't naturally buy at this point, they looked, at the pantry, wherever they keep their stock of stuff for consumption. They thought, I'm going to buy some extra stuff. So they increased their basket size. And on top of that, they actually went to the grocers more frequently. So for instance, in my situation, my normal cycle for grocery shopping was probably once every 10 to 12 days. I was actually going every 4 days because we wanted to make sure that whatever happened in advance, that we had enough food to survive at least 2 or 3 weeks ahead. What this manifested itself in was lineups outside grocery stores, empty shelves of essentials such as toilet rolls, flour, pasta and other essentials, and often restrictions on buying quantities so that you could only have 2 loaves of bread or 3, whatever. So that was really the kind of pattern of demand that groceries and pharmacy chains were having to handle during that first period of lockdown, and they just went into a flat spin. They went straight on to 7/24 working extensively to try to get as much stock into their distribution network, get it out onto the shelves. That was their prime objective, is just to keep the shelves full. Nothing else really mattered. Now, on the supply shock side of things, whereas the demand shock looked like a big spike and it maintained that level of activity and it sort of dwindled down over a period of time, I think the supply shock came in a whole range of different things, and its impact was felt all the way through the COVID period, but for different reasons. initially we obviously had the factory closed, the Chinese factory area got closed, so no production was coming out. So it was a mad scramble to get anything that was on the dock into a container, onto a boat, across the ocean, into our distribution networks. Then there was a whole rash of blank sailings, and for those people who aren't aware of that, that means just cancelled shippings. That wasn't an unusual phenomenon, because blank sailings were a manifestation of the ocean liners, ocean companies, wanting to preserve their profitability. And they've been doing it for quite some time, but to bolster their rates. But this, all of a sudden, there was no traffic to move, and therefore they said, well, we're not going to sail a boat across an ocean just because, to keep the stream working. And on top of that, we also had the fact that we weren't able to, therefore, move empty containers back to the Far East to have them refilled. So the whole thing got out of kilter very quickly. On top of that, there were other factors which started to arise, such as duty hours. I'm not a marine expert, but I've been doing some background reading, and it's something like you're allowed to stay on ship duty for something like 11 months, but you have to have proper home and shore leave. And all that's starting to hit our marine transport industry, that the guys have been working long and extended periods of time, and that's going to have another supply shock. Another supply shock could be things like COVID infecting meat processing factories, where, because we've reduced our footprint for food production to the minimum it can be, and we haven't adopted particularly well social distancing within a number of factories. When one person gets COVID, they pretty much all get COVID, and therefore the factory has to be closed, sanitized, people get taken care of, and it takes some time to get that production plant back up and running. So I'm going to pause for 2 seconds to see if there's any questions or any points that people want to add into the conversation. I want to just talk about the bullwhip effect, because as I dwelled around in LinkedIn to see how people were summarizing what we were experiencing, there was a lot of discussion about the bullwhip effect, because it was something that if you're in the supply chain area, you kind of knew what it meant. For those people who were less supply chain savvy, it sounded like there was one solution. It was a bullwhip effect that was going on. And I have to say that I challenged a number of people on that, because the bullwhip effect has a number of, I wouldn't say assumptions or conditions for it to exist. The first one was a lack of trust and transparency between, say, the retailer and the supplier, or the supplier and the producer. And inefficient communications around what's the demand looking like, what's your capacity to supply looking like, and collaborating on those kind of areas. It requires a version of steady state, so that there's no disturbances in the overall pattern of demand. There might be slight ups and downs, but nothing substantial as this demand shock manifested itself. And there may be forecasting errors, but not to the extent they're statistically significant. And when I talk about statistically significant, if you're doing Lean Six Sigma, 3 sigma above the mean. Often the inventory is used to decouple suppliers from retailers. Inventory is put into position to defend the supplier's capacity, so that if there is a slight variation from the retail point of view, that it's covered off somehow. But it also relies on degrees of disorganization and a lack of supply chain integration. And then maybe technical misunderstandings of how demand is modeled and how we respond to it efficiently. And the last one is gaming. Often retailers are inclined, not they do it in Canada, but they may be inclined to game the system, in the sense that retailers may ask suppliers to put a certain amount of production into their plans, and then as an event like a promotion doesn't go quite well, they tend to cancel the orders and leave the supplier with the problem. So there's a commercial advantage also to be gained by this kind of muddiness around the bullwhip effect, which may also be called the Forrester's demand amplification effect. But I can say that none of these conditions were actually met by the demand spike or shock. What actually happened was, I talked to a number of CPGs at the time, and they said, oh, we're going to have Costco and Walmart just literally shouting at us. What actually happened was the retailers all realized that the sheer scale of the problem they were facing, and they went to the CPGs, people like Conagra, Nestle's, and the like, and said, look, what can we do to make sure we get something on our shelves, because we can't afford to let our customers down and have shortfalls on the shelf. And they actually ended up collaborating. They said, look, we'll take out our private labels, we just do the national brands, let's just get a big lot of production going on that. And when your truck turns up sometime on that day, we're not going to fine you. So that existed for a few weeks, and it was quite an unusual thing for people to, go from that quite adversarial situation where, oh, your fill rate's terrible and you were 2 minutes late, we're going to fine you, to a situation of the retailers and the suppliers really getting down to that basic level of collaboration where they both knew that there was a lot to lose on if they got this wrong. So let's just talk about very quickly about some of the situation that we found ourselves in, particularly as individuals, as a society, in anticipation of going into COVID. So retailing or consumer spending represents something like $650 billion worth of GDP. So somewhere between a quarter and a third of our economy is driven through the retail channel. I have no idea what it's going to look like in 2020. It's going to be severely distorted, but that was certainly the figures from 2019. We have quite a high polarization of income and a very fragile financial position as you go down the earnings gradient. A survey which was issued just before we went into lockdown, certainly in Ontario and other parts of Canada, was 49% of consumers are only $200 away from bankruptcy. So we are literally, for nearly 50% of our population, living from paycheck to paycheck. Now, there's a survey, a detailed piece of research which I dug out, which unfortunately goes back to 2012, said that for the top 20% of income earners, they represent something in the order of 67% of the earnings. The next 20% take that to 90%, which means that 60% represent 10% of earned income. And if you convert that to numbers, at today's sort of working population, that's about between 11 and 12 million workers who are representing something in the order of 10% of earned income. More recently, the Parliamentary Budget Office revised its model of net worth, which is a slightly different version of this, and they moved the top one assumption from 13.7% to 25%, and the entrance requirement for being in the 1% was something like 6.3 million. You had to have a net worth of 6.3 million to feature in there. But they represented something like 25% of the net worth of Canadian population. The top 20% represent 75%, the next 40% adds another 24%, and the bottom 40% of Canadians represent 1.2% of net worth. And that's pretty scary to think about that. And during the sort of height of, I would say, unemployment or underemployment during towards the back end of April, something in the order of 8.4 million Canadians were in a situation of receiving government subsidies through either being under-houred or just not having any hours at all. So we're in a pretty, I would say, precarious situation to face this head on. So let's talk about some of the key consumer influences during the COVID confinement period. The first one was obviously being isolated in your home, or being confined to your home, being sent home during March, stay home. The only time you should come out is just to literally go to the grocery store, pick up your medications if you're on medications, otherwise stay at home. Now that's going to have a pretty dramatic impact on people's view of life, because I don't think many people in Canada, out of 36, 38 million, have ever been told to stay at home. And that has lots of different implications dependent on your family size. If you're in a situation like me, I've been remote working for a long time, and my wife's a remote worker, so to all intents and purposes, apart from at the weekend, it was just business as usual. But if you had a small family, young children, teenagers, whatever, suddenly you were faced with having to look after them, look after their educational interests, look after their stop them being bored and stuff like that. So suddenly the education system, which used to look after them between, say, 8 o'clock in the morning and 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you're now adopting that role. So over an extended period of time, if you're on your own, literally on your own, and maybe you're a young person, middle-aged person, or an older person, that would have also some big impacts on you as an individual. I've just talked through some of the financial issues that people were facing, but if you imagine that if you're on government subsidies, government funding, suddenly your incomes come down and you're starting to think, well, if I've got a small family, and and I'm in this very precarious situation of being only potentially $200, if I'm not close to defaulting on my mortgage or not being able to pay my rent, how does this all come together? And on top of that, I have to go out and fight for food in the stores because there's a queue to go in. I have limits on what I can buy there. I want to fill up my trolley and make sure my family's safe. The impact of direct or indirect COVID exposure. So maybe if you've had somebody in your household contract it, maybe they've recovered, they've been fortunate to recover. Or maybe one of your family members who isn't in your household, or a close friend may have contracted it. Or if you didn't get that direct exposure to COVID, maybe you had it through indirect means like the social media, sitting on CP24, seeing all the different opinions, the graphs, the numbers, etc., just building up a whole sense of fear that this virus is something that we really don't want to catch. And home is safe. Anywhere outside home is not very safe. And then even if you kind of missed all that, and you can probably tell I'm British, so I still take a pretty strong interest in what's happening there in terms of culture and the politics there. When Boris Johnson, the leader of the government, contracted it and he went into hospital, he's on oxygen, it brought it home to many people in Britain that this is a serious thing. There's also the prospect of return to work. When we perhaps got laid off to start with or followed, we've said, oh, that's all right, we'll just sit all day and watch Netflix and perhaps do some overdue jobs around the house. But we suddenly may find that maybe our employer isn't in such a strong state. We may not actually have somewhere to return to work to. And also the extent that we can go back to work, how am I going to get there? I'm going to use public transport. Is it reliable? Am I going to catch something in that transit route? And when I get to work, what's it going to look like? One of the attractions of going to work, besides obviously getting paid, is a social dimension. But if we're meant to be socially distant in a work situation, what's that going to look like? How the colleagues that I used to, spend time around the water cooler, I'm not going to be able to do that. There's a social dimension on that. There's so many things that were probably percolating in people's minds about what does this mean for me? How does this change my values? And the last point, and it's often not really recognized there's been plenty of webinars been going on during this period of time where people are trying to, in some ways, keep relevant. As long as they've got COVID-19 in the title of the webinar, they believe that that's making sure that they will get good attendance. But the sense of abundance has been challenged, and that doesn't tend to feature highly on these consumer behavioural webinars. But imagine this, that the things that you used to take for granted back in February, if you were like me, a project warrior at weekends, used to kind of think, they've got a few projects to do at the weekend, right, Friday, get my materials, nip up to Home Depot, Lowe's, Canadian Tire, whatever big box store you get your stuff from, go and get them, bring them back, Saturday morning, you're on the job. Well, suddenly, as those stores particularly got locked down themselves as part of the second wave of the definition of essential retailing, I had to start planning things on Monday because I didn't know how long the click and collect service would take for me to get the email, get the phone call, whatever it was, to come to the store to pick the stuff up. So it really made me think that things really had changed in a quite a substantive way. But out of all these kind of things, there are often some opportunities, benefits, or alternatives. There's been a big push for contactless services. You will see many, many times where you can buy things, but only on credit or debit card. You can't now use cash because cash could have the virus on it. You could transmit that to the teller and, they catch it. But this has allowed companies, and I'm going to be talking quite retail-centric, for retailers to think or push the agenda of automation, because bringing people into a environment where most of the transactions are repeatable, working in a warehouse, doing selection, or these things can be automated. And prior to COVID, it was always, well, we can automate it, but we may have to face up to some of the conversations we need to have about, does this mean we're going to reduce our staffing requirements? But now, because it can be, in the light of COVID, it can be said, we don't want to bring people into our warehouses where they can get infected. What can we look around here and what can we automate at this time? There might be some more, I would say, positive views around this now because of COVID. We've seen the adoption of traditional, what I call channels of consumption. Back in the day, we'd go out to somewhere nice, do some sightseeing physically, and drop back home. But now we're seeing virtual tours. We're seeing whole ranges of activities which you used to have to turn up and do yourself, but now being transmitted in a virtual way, such as gym things, dancing things, things that we wouldn't have necessarily thought that this is how we're going to conduct ourselves going forward, but they've become part of our, in the short term, certainly part of our culture. Using Zoom, on a personal level, I'd much more prefer to use Zoom than the telephone. There's a big discussion about, with the restrictions on retailers, has this ultimately driven online versus store, and how much of that is likely to be permanent? And I think that there's a lot of people who've never used online and now are using online. People who used to use it a bit are now using it much more furiously. But some of the detracting from this has been the actual digital fulfillment performance of retailers who may have had a platform prior to this, but may have handled a handful of orders a day and thought, we're fully digital now. Has suddenly gone from that level of activity to 500 orders a day. And they've not been able to scale up well, and there have been some notable areas of improvement, let's put it that way. But also the categories that people are buying are much more focused around their health and well-being, things like gym equipment, things around the house, different types of clothes than what we've had been buying in the past, and things around the house in terms of furniture, electronic products, educational products, being using iPads for downloading educational stuff. So that whole change in what we're buying has been an important and noticeable trend. In terms of working, the general guidance was, if you can do your work at home, do it. And I think there's been quite a change in some ways of thinking about remote working. It was when you used to say, could I take tomorrow off? I want to work remote from home because I'm expecting the delivery or something going on. That it was always, really? You're not going to be very productive. You need to come to the office between 9 and 5, and I need to wag my finger over you to make sure you're fully productive. And much of the reading that I've done has suggested that people, despite them having small families, maybe, or large families, and pets and other things going on in their life, and besides the fact that they're not necessarily in a formal office environment in their home, is probably across a kitchen table, people have actually become quite productive. In fact, some reports have said that many people are actually more productive in going to work. And certainly during April, there was some discussion about how the environment starting to clear up. We were seeing animals which wouldn't necessarily be found in the urban districts coming into the urban districts, coyotes and foxes and stuff like that. And the question I've always sort of posed around that is, okay, so this was around about 8 to 10 weeks where everybody was saying the environment's really clearing up, and we can see, the bottom of lakes now, whereas perhaps we weren't able to see that so clearly before. Is it just that we've reached the diminishing returns of our environment clearing up, or do we need to do another 10 weeks, another 10 months, whatever it might be, to actually clean up the environment in terms of pollution? And the last thing on this side is the preparation for future pandemics. As I mentioned earlier on, we've had 5 epidemic/pandemics, and we've experienced this public health crisis with not having enough PPEs and ventilators and respirators in place. Are we in a better position now to actually get our act together and make sure that if we do go into a second lockdown, or maybe we get through this and we have another pandemic, we're much better prepared, and we don't have to sort of throw our economy to one side while we try and defend the strength of it and the capacity of the public healthcare system. So I'm going to just pause now and see if there's any questions in the chats. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on anything I've said or ask any questions at this point. The purpose of this session was to have more of a discussion than me just present for a certain period of time and then have all the questions bundled at the end. So I've noticed many CITT presentations that there's hundreds of questions come out in the last 5 minutes, and they don't always get resolved. So I wanted to make sure that people could raise questions and they get dealt with within the section that is being discussed. Yes, Michael, you raise quite an interesting point. He's asking for those people who can't read a question, what impacts going forward for retail real estate? How will we avoid risks in the future? So I think I'm going to talk from a personal point of view on what I've been trying to do to help retailers. Back in March, I reached out to some of our top retail thought leaders in Canada and look, I said, look guys, we need to figure out what we need to do to help retailers, because retailers are going to be the worst affected from this incident, from being locked down and being mandated to close. And so we had a series of meetings, and we were starting to get close to all the different lobbying bodies. One of the big challenges that we found was the landlords were being particularly intolerant with retailers saying, I can't afford to pay you this month. And we went through the 1st of April, the 1st of May, 1st of June. And it was only in the week before the 1st of June that money was started to be handed towards the retail industry via the landlords to actually try and alleviate the situation. And in fact, I think Ontario was quite late in creating a moratorium to prevent commercial rentees, retailers, from being evicted. They did that for residential, so people who were in rented accommodation were safe, certainly during the period of the lockdown. And of course, landlords would be asking them to make good that at some point. But the retailers who had been told to shut were not being afforded that same benefit. So in terms of retail real estate, what I'm seeing is companies falling into CCAA, which is creditor protection, where they're allowed to continue to trade as best they can under the court supervision to actually look at their real estate or their store fleet and to kind of shake out some of the onerous properties within that to allow them to come out, hopefully emerge from CCAA into a much leaner, fitter 2020s ready operation. I think Sergey's asked the question, do you think there'd be similar demands at supply shop for the upcoming second wave? I'm not really quite sure if firstly, if we're going to be locked down again, and that's a big level of uncertainty for most retailers. And if we are put into a second wave, I think that the amount of money the government has invested in this, before the second wave, if it starts to invest in infrastructure to try and reboot the economy as such, it will find itself in some difficulty with being able to fund at the level it has funded over the last, say, 13 weeks. So I think that we all as individuals must recognise that and do what we can to, take care of ourselves, social distance ourselves, and try and hope that this thing burns itself out. So for those people who think that this uncertainty that we will not, I think that we may be deluding ourselves, that there is huge uncertainty whether or not governments across federal, provincial, regional, municipal will they be reenacting states of emergency and forcing closures of non-essential businesses and forcing us back into our homes to try and make the thing burn out. But in terms of the demand supply shock, of course, if we don't go into a second one, we'll just continue to see the impact of a supply shock. But in terms of demand shock, I believe that the financial situation that we find ourselves in as individuals, we may go out as stores reopen, as malls reopen, we may go out and do some binge spending. But when that credit card bill comes in or our bank goes into more red ink, we will be reining in hopefully reining in some of our discretionary spending, and we will find that has repercussions for many retailers. William asked, do we think this will become an epidemic? We've got COVID-19. In my mind, it's been classified as a global incident, and once it's gone global, I don't think it can be pulled back from global. It may be limited over a period of time into regional areas like Africa, and may be really going to be suffering very badly soon. But I think once you've gone global once you made the statement, it's a pandemic, it means by definition it's across the world. Peter says, I've read the warehouse providers stated to expand available space so that more inventory is within the borders. Well, I think we'll touch on some aspect of that when we go on to the supply chain designs and some of the challenges around that, especially in the next few months. The crisis that the US is going through will have a major effect on the supply of consumer goods for Canada. I think that this whole kind of sort of way that this COVID is rolling out and reaction to it is going to be quite substantial and seismic to trading patterns, certainly in the short term. That we buy stuff from America, and we sell, our biggest trading partner by far is, I think it's something in the order of about 90% of our exports go south of the border. So if there are issues with it's really our ability to push it down south of the border and continue to export. If there's a disruption to that, that has a big knock-on impact onto our economy. Peter says the Fed can only print so much money. I think that's a statement. It's a statement I think we probably all share, that it's easy to print money, and if you're printing in your own currency, printing without borrowing it from other people, where the interest rate is low, and if your assumption is you can really grow the economy at a much faster rate than the interest rate on printing money, then this is how economies have grown in the past. But if you have such a substantial amount of debt that your credit rating for external debt starts to slip, and Canada's, I think Fitch has just recently changed the rating from AAA to AA+. I'm sure that if we continue to throw money at this problem, and if we get a second wave, that will quickly drop down the list to whatever next 2 or 3 levels of credit rating are, we will be in some serious trouble. William says, should either the government or supplier suggest to build up staple supplies just in case there's a second wave? I think that it's a philosophical thing, whether or not you think that, whether you believe that government should tell businesses, who should know better, I would argue, what to do at a commercial level, or you just create the environment that there's a freer dialogue between suppliers and retailers, for instance, and trust them that they will make the right rational decisions. It doesn't always work like that, but I think when government get involved in too many commercial situations, they have a habit of making a bit of a hash of it. They don't necessarily have the full picture. There's lobbying, there's ideology, there's political stances, etc., that can interfere and distort rationality, so they end up, as I say, making a bit of a hash. But the point you make, William, is a fair point, and I'm hoping that businesses are, bearing in mind they are cash constrained, they are still making provision to make sure that they can have some resiliency and can support their typically B2B customers, who then in turn can support our consumers. Michael says, I was reading an article which states that 86% of private restaurants will close. They apparently represent 70% of the restaurant population. The answer to that is, I haven't quite worked out the maths, but in March, before, this was when people actually genuinely believed it was only 2 weeks. I didn't. I thought we wouldn't reopen until at least summer, the start of summer. 10% immediately put their hands up and said, we run out of money, we're dead. And more recently, 50% of restaurants have said we can't reopen because of, one, we've run out of money and or social distancing. We don't have a business model that says we can work with 30% of the revenue we used to have. So some restaurants will just naturally not open because they have to make that decision that they may have the money to reopen, but they can't afford either, one, the social distancing protocols or the disinfectants, the plastic screens, laying out the thing in a different way, and all the mechanics and civils involved in that, and they can't deal with a very low occupation. They're used to having, say for instance, a restaurant may have 100 seats, churn them 2 or 3 times during a session. If that suddenly becomes 40 seats, churn twice, they haven't got a business model that works. My latest expectation is something like 50% of restaurants, typically what we call street accounts, the independent restaurants, are most unlikely to survive this situation. Laurie asked, to William's point, hopefully retailers are stocking up in preparation for the second wave. Yeah, I agree. That's just a rational response of a supplier, a retailer, just making sure that we're investing in the right areas. I'm hoping that many of them have learned some steps about how to be resilient through these kind of periods of disruption, and will be investing in, as I say, in the right areas. And William says no. It will stay worse like a few. Some will get it and some won't. Yeah. Well, William, you're just about as right as me. In some ways, we don't really know. We can hazard an educated guess. Just like, as you say, as winter flu goes through the cycles, there's no reason why this virus won't do the same. The thing about it, it might continue to transform itself and become more or less virulent. We just don't know, and medical professionals around the world are still, although they probably have a sort of a heads up on us, but I think there's still lots to learn about this virus, how it mutates, how it burns out, and importantly how it's going to affect us as individuals, as businesses, and what the government's kind of future interventions need to look like. Contacts. Laurie asked, what do I hear from my contacts? Well, I guess it depends on the nature of my contacts, because many of us actually feel that retailers, for anybody who follows me on LinkedIn, will see that I have this saying called, they're just slinging open their doors and welcoming back in, because they're not actually inclined to do the hard work of what was called transformation, but is now likely to be reinvention. And I'll probably go through those different phrases at the next section. Catalin says, one of the big questions these days, how do you ensure the continuity of production and distribution in case of, yes, I'm going to touch a little bit on resiliency, and in a very sort of like simple, almost technical version of resiliency, it's about how much pipeline stock have you got, say measured in weeks, and then you look at the event that's driving the disruption. How long will that take? If my stock is 6 weeks and the disruption will last 4 weeks, technically I'm resilient because I can weather that storm. And similarly, if my stock is 4 weeks but that disruption is 6 weeks, I'm less than resilient because I'm going to run out of stock. At a very simple level, that seems to be the understand what resiliency really means, but I just don't think that's a good enough, meaningful way of expressing the world. So how do you ensure the continuity and distribution in case of a blockage? Well, we have to actually transcend what we've been doing for decades and decades, which is typically beating up the suppliers or getting let down by suppliers, whatever it is, and we've got to change that conversation. We've got to really understand that, certainly, and almost go back to basics about retailing, which is the purpose of a retailer, if we go back into like the 18th century, 19th century, or even before that, was to offer to consumers convenience of a range of product which they individually couldn't buy, because they would have to buy cases worth or pallets loads, and the retailer allows them to do that. So who wins in that? The retailer and the supplier. If you look at, if you were flying a wall of most buying offices, you'd find that doesn't look like that's a conversation that's really going on at the moment. It's all about, you need to hit this KPI, and that KPI might often be quite silo driven and certainly not horizontally driven as the supply chain works. It's a very involved set of changes that we need to bring about to allow the proper conversation to take part. As I mentioned earlier on, in those early days when Costco, Walmart, Loblaws, Metro, Sobeys and all the other grocers, independent grocers, all named up to the same suppliers, Conagra, Nestle, Kraft, whatever, they actually came to an understanding that they had a physical capacity constraint, and the only way that each of those retailers could stand a chance of keeping something on their shelves was to actually give way and collaborate. And I hope we don't have to go through another COVID-19 kind of incident to continue that conversation. What are your thoughts on the food supply becoming weaponized, i.e. major farm supply fields? I'm on the SEC's food supply chain conversation, and we've got members of the government, we've got the benefit of having Dr. Sylvain Charlebois on there, and he gave a presentation at the last one, and he was saying that the very mechanisms that were designed to make sure that production was efficient and it got to the market in an efficient way have led to something like, I think he said, something like 80 million gallons of raw milk being dumped in the first month or two of COVID, because there wasn't a clear market for it and the pricing mechanism didn't work in the situation of that. And it wasn't just milk or dairy production that he was talking about. He broadened out the discussion to other areas of agricultural production. But I think that we need to revisit this whole thing and try and get more market dynamics in place so that if we overproduce, the price does go down, consumers do get a better deal, or when there's a constraint on production, that prices naturally have to rise because there's less of it. But again, these are the real important conversations to be having, believing that during that conversation, one guy said, well, Gary, when I asked the question that challenged what was being said, one of the guys turned around and he said, well, Gary, it's not as broken as you describe it. I wasn't actually describing it as broken. I'm just saying it's not fit for purpose anymore. We need to rethink. We need to have that conversation. Barry asks, Gary, an opinion on the challenges with the supply chains related to the food service industry, well, I think I've touched on one of those, is the mechanisms by which producers and suppliers interact with each other in terms of any government regulation, and that is probably was done with the best intent, but it might need a good revisit. Otherwise, we'll find that, we've got, the last time I looked, something like 350,000 people in Ontario on food bank support, and yet we're tipping things like milk into, I guess, a local lake or however they dispose of it. We need to join these things up more clearly so that we don't have people on food banks. Food is more accessible, cheaper in some ways, so that more people can go to their grocery store, buy the food they need, and not have to be supported by food banks. Bonnie asked, perhaps focus should shift to creating more manufacturing, etc., based now domestically here in Canada instead of buying the lower cost. Yeah. Well, I'm going to be touching on that next time, if you don't mind, Bonnie. If you want to raise that again, I'm more than happy to do that, and I may have dealt with it by the time you raise it. Sagar raises, do you think e-com model will now flourish after all this is over? Yes, absolutely. I'm hoping, I'm crossing my fingers very tightly, that we move out of a paradigm of the only place you can get stuff is a store, and e-commerce is just like a distraction. We have to do it if we're a retailer, and we've got our bright young things called digital, and they do the website and the app, and they do that social media and Twitter thing, to actually having a much more integrated view of the world. If we are selling staples, please don't come to our shop to buy staples. We'll work with you as a customer, and we will ship to you the staples we think you need. And you can perhaps, there's be some kind of intervention mechanism that's saying, we're going to send you, $200 worth of stuff, which we think you're going to need during this week's cycle. So there's a lot more work to be done on this whole interface between consumers and retailing. And it does depend on which category you're in, how deep you want to be in there, and what kind of service you want to give to the customers who come into your store. Is a store somewhere where a consumer just connects with the brand, gets inspiration, does discovery, gets their problem solved, or is this, and that's where I would be. But for the stuff that store had traditionally had on the shelf, let's take that out of the situation and encourage our consumers to do that online, or, as I say, work with them to say, like Amazon did 5 or 6 years ago here, that they were trying to do predictive demand plans and just put stuff on your doorstep that you might need. On Catalan, stocks are the main issue. Emergency stocks close to the production facility. I agree with that. We have to re-scope the whole purpose of the supply chain. What does it need to do now? How does it need to change? Because we can't have fairly extended geographical supply chains so dependent on, and again, not a political point, on a non-democratically appointed government. What history has shown us is democracies don't go to war. They go to trade with each other. That's how they grow with each other. That's how they kind of win with each other. Whereas when you have undemocratically appointed governments who have a series of agendas which aren't so well understood in Western democracies, or so well appreciated, let's put it that way, things can happen and we can be caught out. And this situation has drawn attention to the pattern of behavior where we've fallen into this trap. Okay, we had the Japanese nuclear power thing disrupted. We've had some global events in terms of weather systems, but we still carried on. And because we're driven by having cheap stuff. And where do we get cheap stuff? We get it from China because they've got a severe labor differential and regulation differential to typical Western democratically appointed nation states. So yes, we either have to make it within friendly nations or in domestic markets, or we have to revisit this whole thing. But how do you do that? How quickly can you actually switch production? I'm not talking about switching from China to Vietnam, or we've still got the same problem of geographically extended supply chain. So we've got 8-10 weeks maybe of stock floating around in our system, which gives us a degree of inflexibility, as especially if we're in a fashion business. We don't really want that amount of stock down there, because our method for dealing with that is running deep markdown programs. We want to get away from markdowns. We want to get close to our production, close to our market, so we can actually turn things around really fast. And therefore, we typically make much more sustainable and profitable businesses. And Rajan has asked, Gary, can you highlight some strategic shifts that this has to look at, assuming next 12 months? Well, hopefully I've certainly from a retail-centric point of view, I've highlighted some of the major conversational points that need to be talked through between suppliers, retailers, producers, to actually get that conversation going. Once we've got that conversation going, we can actually start meaningful actions. But while we're where we are, we still have to work within the kind of silos that we've had, and we need to break those silos down. I'm conscious the time's gone on. Apologies. I obviously got into my swing of it. Marion, I'll pass back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gary. Just a quick reminder that we have the part 2 of your webinar, of your presentation, on Tuesday at noon, so make sure that you register for the second part. And as I was mentioning, we will probably have the second part on Zoom, so just be ready for a change for the next session. Thank you so much. You will be receiving the presentation and the recording link this afternoon from me. And if you have any question, feel free to contact me. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your team. You can connect with me via the website retail.ca and go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn by typing linkedin.com/in/last-mile. Look forward to hearing from you and playing an active part with your supply chain and your business's transformation as you start to act boldly, think big, scale, adapt, and win.